He was worth $87 million on Monday. By Friday, no one would answer his call. The board removed him. His friends disappeared. Even his own brother said it was too messy. But the person who stayed was the woman who cleaned his house. And what her children did next changed everything. On the morning Daniel Whitmore lost everything, the stock market opened like any other day, and by noon his name was being erased from it. For 23 years, Daniel had lived in glass offices, glass conference rooms, glass-walled boardrooms high above Manhattan, and he believed that transparency meant control, that wealth meant security, that success meant permanence. That belief collapsed before lunch. The acquisition he had championed was supposed to be his legacy move, the strategic expansion that would secure his company for another decade and cement his identity as a disciplined visionary. Analysts praised it, investors applauded it, and financial magazines ran his portrait beside headlines about foresight and calculated risk. But buried inside the structure of the deal was leverage he underestimated and a partner he trusted more than he should have. When the market corrected, it did not whisper. It detonated. By late morning, Whitmore Holdings had lost nearly a third of its value. By early afternoon, banks were restricting liquidity, and the board scheduled an emergency session without him. No one shouted during that meeting. No one accused him directly. They used clean words like fiduciary responsibility and market stabilization. They thanked him for his leadership and then voted to remove him for the protection of the company. When Daniel walked back into his office, the skyline looked the same, but it no longer felt like something he owned. His assistant avoided his eyes. His phone stopped ringing. Messages that once demanded his attention were replaced by silence. He called 3 colleagues who had toasted him at charity galas. All went to voicemail. He called a senator whose campaign he had funded. The call did not connect. He called his younger brother in Connecticut, and the hesitation in his brother's voice said more than any refusal. "Danny, I can't get involved," his brother said carefully. "This could get messy." Messy. The word echoed in Daniel's mind long after the call ended. By evening, news networks replayed his image under phrases like executive miscalculation and over-leveraged empire. Commentators dissected his fall with detached fascination, as if watching a controlled demolition. Daniel drove back to his estate in Westchester just after sunset. The gates opened automatically. The gravel crunched beneath his tires exactly as it had the day before. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything felt hollow. His wife Clara had been gone for 3 years, taken slowly by cancer that neither money nor influence could fight. The house had felt empty after her funeral, but this felt different. This felt exposed. He walked through the kitchen, the marble counters untouched, the appliances silent. On the island lay a small folded note he didn't recognize. It wasn't from a bank or a law firm. It was handwritten in uneven script. He opened it and read, "Thank you for letting Mama work here. We're praying for you." The words were simple, childlike, almost awkward. Daniel stood there longer than he intended. He couldn't remember the name of the woman who cleaned the house. The staff had always been managed through a service. He signed checks automatically, rarely noticing faces. Yet somewhere in his home, someone had known he was falling and had chosen gratitude over distance. That unsettled him more than the financial collapse. He walked into the living room where Clara's portrait hung above the fireplace. The painter had captured her steady warmth, the way she could look at someone and see beyond their titles. She had once told him that legacy was not built in boardrooms but in quiet rooms where no one was watching. He had dismissed that as sentimental thinking. Now he stood in a silent house facing the possibility that she had understood something he never did. His phone buzzed again with a formal notice from the bank regarding asset reviews and collateral exposure. Even the estate itself was no longer untouchable. Daniel lowered himself into a leather chair that suddenly felt too large and read the child's note again. "We're praying for you." He had built an empire on control, negotiation, leverage, and discipline. But he had never prepared for the humiliation of being abandoned in a single day. Outside, the last light drained from the sky, leaving the windows black and reflective. Inside that reflection, Daniel no longer saw a powerful executive. He saw a man who had mastered profit but neglected presence, who had secured assets but failed to notice the people quietly sustaining his home. And as the night settled over the estate, one truth became impossible to ignore: by morning, the banks would begin dismantling his empire, and he would discover just how quickly a powerful man can become irrelevant when the numbers disappear. Chapter 2, The Woman He Never Saw. The only person who returned to the house after the headlines faded was the woman he had never truly seen. 2 days after Daniel's removal from his own company, while former partners were issuing carefully worded statements and investors were quietly distancing themselves, Sarah Collins arrived at the estate before sunrise with a bucket, a vacuum, and the same steady routine she had kept for nearly 2 years. She had watched powerful men come and go through those doors without ever being noticed, and she understood something about silence that Daniel was only beginning to learn. She was 36, a widow for 4 years, raising 2 children in a small Yonkers apartment where the radiator hissed in winter and the ceiling carried faint water stains from the upstairs neighbor's shower. Her husband, Mark, had died in a construction accident that never made the news. There were no settlements large enough to change her life, no inheritance beyond a worn wedding ring, and 2 children who still sometimes set a place for him at dinner out of habit. Work had not been optional for her. It had been survival. Daniel never knew that she cleaned his wife's study more carefully than any other room, or that she replaced the lilies near Clara's portrait every Thursday with flowers she paid for herself when the management service stopped ordering them. She did it because she recognized grief when she saw it. That morning, she noticed the difference immediately. The house felt unsettled, as if its foundation had shifted. Daniel was sitting at the dining table surrounded by folders and unopened mail, still in the same suit from the day before, though the tie was gone and the top button of his shirt was undone. He looked smaller somehow, not physically diminished but stripped of something invisible. When he looked up and saw her, there was confusion in his eyes, as if he were trying to place her in his memory. "You're still coming?" he asked, his voice lacking the authority it once carried. "Yes," she replied calmly. "Until I'm told not to." He nodded slowly, as though absorbing the idea that someone had chosen to show up without obligation. "The estate may be liquidated," he said after a moment. "You might want to look for other work." Sarah didn't react with panic. She had lived with uncertainty long enough to understand its rhythm. "I'll start looking," she said, "but I'll finish what I start." There was no accusation in her tone, no pity either. Just steadiness. Daniel watched her as she moved through the room, wiping down surfaces that had already lost their shine. The quiet between them was not hostile. It was unfamiliar. After a while, she paused near Clara's portrait and adjusted the frame slightly, the way she always did when it tilted from the air conditioning draft. "She liked fresh lilies," Sarah said gently, not turning around. Daniel stiffened. "You knew my wife?" "No," Sarah answered. "But I know what love leaves behind." He didn't respond immediately. Something about her certainty unsettled him. For years, people had spoken to him with deference or ambition. They wanted something from him: access, influence, approval. Sarah wanted nothing. That absence felt disarming. "Why would you leave that note?" he asked finally, holding up the folded paper he had kept in his pocket. For a brief second, surprise crossed her face. Then understanding. "My daughter wrote that," she said. "She heard me talking about what happened." Daniel frowned slightly. "She doesn't even know me." Sarah met his eyes. Children don't measure worth by headlines. The statement lingered in the room longer than he expected. Daniel looked back down at the paper. The uneven handwriting felt heavier now. "You shouldn't involve your kids in this," he said quietly, though there was no force behind it. "They insisted," she replied. "When their father died, people stopped coming around. Grief makes people uncomfortable. I didn't want them to learn that lesson again." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He remembered the weeks after Clara's funeral, how friends had brought food for a few days and then gradually disappeared, unsure how to navigate his silence. He had buried himself in work because it required no vulnerability. He realized now that he had done the same thing people had done to him. He had avoided what felt complicated. "I don't need charity," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Sarah shook her head gently. "It isn't charity. It's presence." There was no softness in her voice now, only conviction shaped by experience. She finished cleaning and gathered her supplies, but before she left, she hesitated near the door. "You're not the only one who's lost something," she said quietly. "Just don't lose yourself too." When the door closed behind her, the house felt different again, not fuller but less suffocating. Daniel stood alone in the hallway staring at Clara's portrait, replaying the conversation in his mind. For the first time since the collapse, he wasn't thinking about markets or lawsuits. He was thinking about identity, about the uncomfortable possibility that he had mistaken power for permanence and control for connection. And as he stood there, holding a note written by a child who owed him nothing, Daniel Whitmore began to understand that losing his company might not be the worst thing that had happened to him. Because the more unsettling realization was this: someone invisible had seen his fall more clearly than any executive ever had, and he had no idea what it would mean if she chose not to walk away. Chapter 3, $23. The day the electricity was cut off, Daniel Whitmore learned that pride doesn't keep the lights on. It happened 3 weeks after the board removed him and 10 days after the banks formally began restructuring his assets. The estate was already under review, legal notices arriving with mechanical precision, and most of the staff had quietly disappeared once their contracts expired. Daniel had moved into the smaller guest house at the back of the property to reduce expenses, telling himself it was temporary, strategic, controlled. But when the power shut down in the main house and the silence swallowed the hum of climate systems and security monitors, the illusion of control fractured. For decades, he had negotiated 9-figure deals without hesitation. Now he stood in a darkened kitchen staring at a refrigerator that no longer worked, realizing he didn't know how long food lasted without electricity. The quiet felt different from grief. Grief had weight, this felt like exposure. He drove into town that afternoon, sold a watch he once wore to charity galas, and deposited the check without allowing himself to calculate how symbolic the gesture was. Back at the estate, Sarah was finishing what might be her final week of work before liquidation. She had already begun applying for other cleaning jobs, adjusting her schedule, protecting her children from the instability she sensed approaching. That afternoon, she brought Lily and Noah with her because school had closed early and she couldn't afford a sitter. She told them to stay near the garden while she worked. Daniel didn't expect to see them. When he stepped outside to take a call from a lawyer and found 2 children standing near the hedges that once hosted summer fundraisers, something shifted in the scene. The property looked less like a symbol of wealth and more like borrowed ground. Lily noticed him first. She nudged her younger brother and whispered something before walking forward with the cautious bravery of someone who has rehearsed a moment in her head. In her hands was a small envelope, edges worn from being carried. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice steady but soft, "we wanted to give you something." Daniel glanced toward Sarah, who had just stepped out onto the patio, her expression unreadable but not embarrassed. "You didn't have to bring them here," he said quietly to her. "I didn't," she replied. "They asked." Lily extended the envelope. Daniel hesitated before taking it. Inside were crumpled bills and loose coins. $23. He looked up slowly. "What is this?" Noah answered before his sister could. "We've been saving it. Mama said things are hard for you." Daniel felt heat rise to his face, not from anger but from something closer to shame. He had spent years calculating worth in millions, evaluating human value by productivity and leverage, and now 2 children from a 1-bedroom apartment were offering him their savings. "I can't take this," he said immediately, trying to hand it back. Lily shook her head. "When Dad died, I gave Mama my piggy bank. She said it helped because it meant we were in it together. Sarah stepped closer but didn't interrupt. Daniel noticed the way she let them speak for themselves. This isn't your responsibility, he insisted, though his voice lacked its former authority. Noah shrugged slightly. Mama says everyone deserves at least one person who doesn't leave. The words landed harder than any financial headline. Daniel crouched down so he was at eye level with them, something he had not done for any child in years. He saw no pity in their faces, only sincerity. They weren't trying to rescue him. They were trying to stand beside him. Why would you do this for me? He asked, more to himself than to them. Lily answered simply, because you look like you're alone. That was the moment something in him cracked. Not pride exactly, but the rigid shell he had built around vulnerability. He thought about the phone calls that had gone unanswered, the colleagues who had vanished, the brother who had chosen safety over solidarity. These children owed him nothing. Yet here they were, offering the only thing they could give. Daniel closed his hand around the envelope. If I accept this, he said carefully, it won't be because I need the money. We know, Sarah said quietly. Then why? He asked. She met his eyes with calm conviction. Because sometimes accepting help is how you learn what it's worth. He stood slowly, still holding the envelope. The estate behind him no longer felt like an emblem of failure. It felt like a backdrop to something far more unsettling, the realization that he had spent most of his life being admired but not known. As Sarah gathered her children to leave, Daniel watched their aging sedan pull down the long driveway, its engine coughing faintly before steadying. He stood there long after the car disappeared beyond the gates. In his hand was $23, wrinkled and warm from small hands. For the first time since the collapse, he felt something stronger than humiliation. He felt accountable. Not to shareholders. Not to banks. But to two children who believed that standing beside someone mattered more than standing above them. And as evening settled over the darkened estate, Daniel Whitmore understood that rebuilding his fortune would be difficult, but rebuilding his character would demand something he had never truly practiced before. The question that followed him back into the silent house was one he could no longer ignore. If children with almost nothing could choose loyalty over fear, what excuse did a grown man with everything once have for not doing the same? Chapter 4, The Clause No One Noticed. The proof of Daniel Whitmore's betrayal was buried in a paragraph no one thought to read twice. It was nearly midnight when he found it, sitting alone in a rented storage unit that smelled faintly of dust and cardboard, surrounded by boxed files from an empire that no longer existed. After the estate officially entered liquidation proceedings, Daniel had been forced to vacate within 30 days. The mansion was auctioned quietly to a private buyer. The guest house, the gardens, the rooms Clara once walked through, all reduced to line items. He now rented a modest two-bedroom townhouse near a commuter rail line where passing trains rattled the windows at night. It was the kind of place he once would have described as transitional housing. Now it was simply home. He had spent weeks reviewing contracts from the acquisition that triggered his collapse. At first, he believed the failure was his alone, an overextension of confidence, a miscalculation of market volatility. But something about the timing had never sat right. The speed at which liquidity was restricted. The quiet way his longtime partner, Richard Hale, had distanced himself during the board vote. Richard had built his reputation alongside Daniel's. 15 years of shared deals. 15 years of trust reinforced by shared success. That trust now felt naive. As Daniel flipped through a marked-up copy of the acquisition agreement, he noticed a cross-reference in a liability clause that had been revised during final negotiations. The language shifted exposure from a shared risk model to a concentrated burden, one that legally positioned Daniel as the primary guarantor in the event of market downturn. The revision had been subtle, wrapped in technical phrasing that appeared routine. Daniel leaned back in the folding chair and read it again slowly. He remembered that final meeting. Richard had insisted on late adjustments due to investor sensitivities. Daniel had signed off, trusting the intent behind the edits. Now, in the silence of the storage unit, he realized the adjustment had not been protective. It had been strategic, just not for him. His name alone carried the financial weight when the markets turned. Richard's assets had been shielded. The realization did not come with rage. It came with clarity. Betrayal, he understood, rarely announces itself loudly. It operates in fine print. Daniel closed the binder and sat in the dim light, listening to the distant hum of traffic. For weeks, he had told himself that losing his company was a consequence of ambition. Now he saw it might also be the result of manipulation. The distinction mattered. The next morning, he drove to Yonkers. He had not planned the visit, he simply found himself there. Sarah opened the door cautiously, surprised to see him standing in the narrow hallway of her apartment building. The place was clean but modest, the scent of laundry detergent lingering in the air. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "I found something." He explained the clause, the structural shift in liability, the legal implications. He did not dramatize it. He spoke as he would have in a boardroom, but there was no audience now, just a woman who had once cleaned his floors and two children finishing homework at a small kitchen table. Sarah listened carefully. "You think he planned it," she said. "I think he protected himself," Daniel replied. "At my expense." She was quiet for a moment. "So what happens now?" "I could file a lawsuit," he said. "It won't restore everything. But it would expose the truth." Noah looked up from his math worksheet. "If someone cheated you, shouldn't you say something?" Daniel almost smiled at the simplicity. Adults complicated justice. Children reduced it to principle. "It's not that simple," he replied gently. Sarah met his gaze. "Is it about money?" "Partly," he admitted. "But mostly it's about my name." She considered that. "Then ask yourself why it matters," she said. "If it's pride, let it go. If it's truth, fight for it." The distinction struck him harder than she probably intended. For most of his career, Daniel had equated reputation with power. But reputation built on silence about wrongdoing felt hollow now. "And if I lose again?" he asked quietly. Sarah's voice softened. "Then at least you'll know you stood for something other than profit." That night, Daniel retained legal counsel. Filing the suit was not dramatic. There were no press conferences. Just paperwork submitted in federal court alleging intentional misrepresentation and concealed liability adjustments. The media noticed within days. Headlines framed it as a disgraced executive attempting to deflect blame. Commentators speculated about desperation. Richard Hale issued a calm public denial, expressing disappointment in Daniel's claims. Depositions followed. Emails surfaced. Draft revisions were compared. Under scrutiny, the adjusted clause appeared less like oversight and more like calculated insulation. During one deposition, when confronted with timeline discrepancies, Richard hesitated. It was brief, a fraction of a second, but Daniel saw it. For the first time since his removal, he felt something steady inside himself. Not vengeance. Alignment. Months later, the court ruled partially in Daniel's favor. The judge acknowledged material concealment in the contractual adjustment. Financial damages were awarded, though not enough to restore his former empire. More importantly, the ruling clarified that the collapse had not been solely his misjudgment. It had been engineered vulnerability. The media shifted tone. Analysts recalibrated their narratives. Former colleagues reached out cautiously, testing the waters of his renewed credibility. Daniel declined most invitations. When he stepped out of the courthouse that day, reporters shouted questions about his next move. He gave a simple answer. "I'm not rebuilding what I had," he said. "I'm building something different." That evening, he returned to Yonkers with a folder in hand. Sarah invited him in. Lily and Noah sat quietly, sensing the gravity in the room. Daniel placed the folder on the table. "I received damages," he said. "Not enough for an empire. Enough for a beginning." Sarah studied him carefully. "And?" He slid the documents toward her. "I'm starting a new firm. Smaller. Transparent. Focused on protecting businesses from the kind of structural traps I missed." She looked at the paperwork but didn't touch it yet. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. Daniel's voice was steady. "Because the first people who invested in me after I lost everything were your children." He paused, then added, "And I want you involved." The room went still. Lily glanced at her mother. Noah stopped tapping his pencil. Sarah finally opened the folder and saw trust documents, education funds for her children, and equity shares allocated in the new company structure. Her eyes lifted slowly. "Daniel, this is too much." "No," he replied quietly. "It's exactly enough." She searched his face for signs of obligation or guilt and found neither. What she saw instead was intention. For the first time since the collapse, Daniel was not reacting. He was choosing. But as hopeful as the moment felt, he knew something else was waiting, something more personal than contracts or court rulings. Because clearing his name in public was one thing. Facing the deeper truth of who he had been before the fall would require a different kind of courage. And that reckoning was closer than he realized. Chapter 5, The Things He Didn't See. The lawsuit restored Daniel Whitmore's name, but it did not restore his peace. The court ruling shifted public opinion, investors quietly reconsidered their distance, and industry publications reframed his fall as a calculated betrayal rather than reckless ambition. Financially, he could breathe again. Emotionally, he could not. Success returned in measured steps. His new firm operated out of a modest office in White Plains, focused on ethical restructuring and transparency clauses that protected smaller business owners from the kind of liability trap he had missed. The work was steady, purposeful, even meaningful. Yet at night, when the commuter trains rumbled past his townhouse and the lights dimmed across the street, Daniel found himself staring at Clara's portrait mounted above a narrow hallway table. It was smaller than the original frame in the estate, but her expression carried the same quiet intelligence. He began bringing fresh lilies home every Thursday without thinking about it. Habit became ritual. Ritual became confession. One evening, Sarah visited with Lily and Noah after Daniel insisted they see the new office space. The children were older now in subtle ways, their posture straighter, their voices steadier. They walked through the modest conference room as if it were something grand, not because of its size but because of what it represented. After they left to explore the small courtyard outside, Sarah remained in the hallway where Clara's portrait hung. She noticed the flowers first. "You still remember," she said softly. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "I never forgot," he replied. "I just didn't prioritize." The words felt heavier than he intended. Sarah waited, sensing the shift in his tone. "When Clara was diagnosed, I told myself expansion was temporary," Daniel continued. "I believed if I secured the next acquisition, the next growth phase, I'd create stability. I thought I was protecting her future." His voice lowered. But she didn't need a future portfolio. She needed time. The admission lingered in the room like dust catching light. For years, he had justified his absence with ambition. Hospital appointments missed because of negotiations. Evenings shortened by conference calls. He had convinced himself that sacrifice in the present guaranteed comfort later. Later never came. "She never blamed you," Sarah said carefully. "You don't know that," he replied. "I wasn't there enough to hear it." Sarah studied the portrait. "Grief rewrites memory," she said. "It amplifies regret." Daniel shook his head slightly. "This isn't grief exaggerating. This is clarity." He had built a life around acquisition, scale, legacy in the corporate sense. But Clara's illness had revealed a different measurement of inheritance, one that had nothing to do with assets. He remembered a night near the end when she asked him to sit beside her without his phone. He had stayed for 15 minutes before stepping into the hallway to answer a call about investor confidence. He told himself it was necessary. Now that memory felt like betrayal, not of contract but of presence. "I keep thinking about something your daughter said," he admitted. "That I looked alone." Sarah didn't interrupt. "I wasn't alone," he continued quietly. "I just didn't know how to stay." The confession settled between them. Outside, Lily laughed at something Noah said, their voices drifting through the open window. Daniel listened to the sound as if it were fragile. "Why did you really help me?" he asked again, though he had asked before. Sarah answered without hesitation this time. "Because my children were watching," she said. "And I wanted their inheritance to be compassion, not fear." The word inheritance struck him differently now. He had once equated inheritance with estates and equity shares. But Sarah was describing something intangible, values passed through action. Daniel looked again at Clara's portrait. "I thought I was building her a legacy," he said softly. "But I was building something that required her absence to maintain." Sarah stepped closer to the hallway table. "Legacy isn't what you leave behind when you're gone," she said. "It's what people feel when they're with you." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. For the first time since Clara's death, he allowed himself to sit fully inside the regret instead of negotiating with it. It did not destroy him. It steadied him. He understood now that the fall of his company had exposed more than corporate vulnerability. It had exposed personal blindness. The betrayal by Richard Hale hurt, but it was external. The deeper wound was self-inflicted, years spent believing that success excused absence. "I can't fix the past," he said quietly. "No," Sarah agreed. "But you can decide what your presence looks like now." The simplicity of that statement anchored him. Redemption did not require grand gestures. It required consistency. Showing up. Staying. Listening. That night, after Sarah and the children left, Daniel remained in the hallway long after the house went quiet. He adjusted Clara's frame slightly, the way Sarah used to. He did not speak aloud, but the apology formed clearly in his mind. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. For the first time, he felt something shift from guilt to responsibility. If his new firm succeeded, it would not be to rebuild status. It would be to create protection for others who might miss what he had missed. If he invested in Lily and Noah's education, it would not be repayment. It would be partnership. And if he ever spoke publicly about his fall, he would speak not about market volatility but about presence. Yet even as that clarity settled, Daniel sensed that transformation would soon be tested. Growth always invites scrutiny. And somewhere beyond the modest walls of his new life, an opportunity was forming that would force him to prove whether his change was permanent or temporary. Because rebuilding a reputation is one thing. Living a different truth when power returns is another entirely. 5 years after Daniel Whitmore lost his empire, he was invited to stand on a stage again, not in a glass tower above Manhattan, but inside a renovated community center built from money he once would have dismissed as insignificant. The room was modest, filled with small business owners, single parents, local reporters, and folding chairs arranged in imperfect rows. A banner behind the podium read Whitmore Foundation for Ethical Enterprise. It wasn't a corporation. It wasn't a comeback tour. It was something quieter, and far more deliberate. When Daniel stepped forward, there were no flashing stock tickers or industry analysts measuring his net worth. There were families. There were children. There were people who had nearly lost everything and were trying to rebuild without being swallowed by predatory contracts or hidden clauses. 5 years earlier, he would have viewed this room as peripheral to real influence. Now he understood it differently. Influence was not measured by market dominance. It was measured by who remained standing when crisis came. The foundation had grown slowly, intentionally. Instead of aggressive expansion, Daniel chose steady protection. The firm he built after the lawsuit focused on transparent agreements and defensive legal structures for small enterprises vulnerable to exploitation. Profits were sustainable, not spectacular. That was intentional. He no longer chased scale. He pursued stability. In the front row sat Sarah, composed but quietly proud, and beside her were Lily and Noah, no longer small children clutching an envelope of savings, but confident young adults shaped by years of witnessing transformation rather than wealth. Lily had become an advocate for financial literacy programs within underserved communities. Noah was studying law, determined to specialize in corporate accountability. Daniel often wondered whether their paths would have formed differently had they not walked through his fall with him. When he began his speech, his voice was calm, measured, free of the sharp ambition that once defined him. 5 years ago, he said, I believed success meant expansion. I believed power meant insulation. I was wrong. The room remained silent, attentive. When my company collapsed, I thought I had lost everything. What I had actually lost long before that was perspective. He paused briefly, letting the weight of the words settle. I built contracts to protect assets, but I failed to protect relationships. I chased inheritance in numbers instead of character. He did not mention Richard Hale by name. He did not recount the legal battle. That chapter no longer defined him. Instead, he spoke about transparency, about the responsibility of leadership, about how grief and failure can either harden a person or refine them. The foundation you see today, he continued, exists because, when I had nothing left but reputation damage and debt, someone with far less chose not to walk away. He turned slightly toward the front row. Sarah did not lower her gaze. Lily's eyes shimmered, but she remained steady. Noah straightened unconsciously, absorbing the moment. 2 children once handed me $23, Daniel said. A soft ripple moved through the audience, unsure whether to laugh or remain solemn. It wasn't the amount that changed me. It was the decision behind it. They didn't calculate return on investment. They acted out of loyalty. He rested his hands lightly on the podium. That was the first ethical partnership I had ever experienced without paperwork. The audience smiled gently, but the weight of the statement lingered. After the ceremony, reporters approached him again, as they often did when narratives of redemption circulated. Would you ever return to large-scale corporate expansion? One asked. The old Daniel would have answered with strategy. The new Daniel answered with clarity. Growth without conscience is just scale, he said. I'm not interested in scale anymore. Later that afternoon, after the guests dispersed and the folding chairs were stacked away, Daniel remained in the quiet hall with Sarah and the now-grown children. He handed Lily a small framed document. Inside it was the original envelope, preserved carefully, with the $23 sealed behind glass. With interest, he said softly. Noah laughed gently. We didn't expect a return. Daniel met his eyes. It was never about return. It was about identity. Sarah watched the exchange without speaking. She had once cleaned his floors. Now she sat on the board of a foundation that protected families like her own from exploitation. Their relationship had never crossed into romance or obligation. It was rooted in mutual respect, something stronger than dependency. You kept your promise, she said quietly. Daniel shook his head slightly. No, he replied. You kept me accountable to it. Outside, the late afternoon sun filtered through the center's windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Daniel thought about Clara, about the nights he chose conference calls over hospital chairs. The regret had not disappeared with time, but it had transformed into direction. He could not rewrite the years he missed, but he could ensure that the institutions he now built would not require the same sacrifice from others. That was the redemption he chose. As they stepped outside together, children from a nearby workshop ran past them laughing, their voices echoing against brick walls that once housed a shuttered factory. The space had been reclaimed, not for profit, but for opportunity. Daniel realized something in that moment that would have sounded naive to his former self: legacy is not what survives your absence. It is what strengthens in your presence. 5 years earlier, he stood alone in a darkened estate believing that relevance had vanished with market value. Now he stood in ordinary sunlight surrounded by people who knew him not as a CEO, but as a man who stayed. The skyline in the distance still shimmered, but it no longer defined him. What defined him was simpler and far more durable: the choice to accept help without ego, to pursue truth without vengeance, and to measure wealth by the lives protected rather than the assets acquired. And as the doors of the foundation closed for the evening, Daniel Whitmore understood that the greatest fortune he would ever hold was not stored in accounts or estates, but in the quiet, unwavering decision of 3 people who refused to leave when the world decided he was no longer worth staying for.